Today's lecture covers the NSDA June 2022 public forum debate topic that's going to be used at nationals. The resolution is resolved. The United States should establish a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan. In today's lecture, I'm going to review the major terms of the resolution, provide some important background, review the many pro arguments, some of the con arguments, and suggest some other arguments for weighing or consideration. Now, first, let's talk about Taiwan. There's actually a debate about whether or not Taiwan is an independent country or it's a territory of China. And the United States kind of takes an ambiguous position. At the end of China's civil war in 1949, the PRC, or the People's Republic of China, controlled mainland China. Mainland China is what you see there in the red. That's obviously kind of a majority of the territory, with Beijing as the capital. The ROC, or the Republic of China, controlled what is in kind of a dark orange there in the circle, which is obviously a small island. Until 1979, the United States actually recognized that Republic of China as the government of China. But then, as you may have heard of in history, Nixon went to China, the United States built up relations with China, and the United States has recognized the PRC, the People's Republic of China, is actually the kind of the legitimate kind of government and the legitimate country of China. Now, the United States still maintains relations with the ROC, or the Republic of China, right? Based in Taiwan. We have a Taiwan Institute and an informal diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, and we actually sell it as a substantial number of weapons to defend itself. But as you can imagine, and as you may know, there is a lot of kind of tension between China and Taiwan. This has kind of taken on a lot of additional significance because there's always been a debate about whether or not kind of mainland China would essentially attack Taiwan to kind of reabsorb it into mainland China. And, there's a debate about, well, gee, based on what Russia has done in the Ukraine, Russia thinks that Ukraine is like a legitimate part of its territory, right? Whether or not that would happen to Taiwan as well. And that is kind of an important part about whether or not the United States should establish a bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan. In terms of trade, the United States does not have a formal free trade agreement with Taiwan, but we started out and we signed a trade and investment framework agreement, which has kind of been in a way, it's been going on since 1994. I'll talk about that in a bit. However, there's some annual meetings to help kind of resolve these kind of trade issues that arise that we'll talk about between the United States and Taiwan. But before moving forward with that, let's unpack a few terms. I mean, trade, you're probably familiar with trade is. Trade is simply the exchange of goods. In this case, it's between countries. So the United States is selling some goods to Taiwan. Companies in the United States are selling some goods to Taiwan, and companies in Taiwan are selling some goods to the United States. Agreement is going to be referred to a formal agreement, like a legally binding agreement. Now, obviously, there's not really necessarily an enforcement body that at least has the capacity to kind of physically enforce a law, but countries kind of tend to, trade agreements are subject to interpretation, but countries do kind of tend to abide by them. Bilateral just means it's between two countries. So we're talking about a trade agreement that's just between the United States and Taiwan. It's not between the United States, Taiwan, and any other countries. Comprehensive means that it's going to kind of cover pretty much all the areas, the major areas related to trade. So, for example, as we'll see, there's been disputes about kind of agriculture access and who can sell what agriculture product or which agriculture products in which markets, how we kind of protect intellectual property. The idea of this was all be resolved in a comprehensive trade agreement. Now, what the literature is mostly referring to is what's called a free trade agreement. All right, a free trade agreement. They probably just should have put that in the resolution. But there's proposals that have been made that the United States and Taiwan basically kind of come together, agree to open their own markets under terms of kind of free trade to reduce what we call trade barriers, which are usually tariffs. A tariff is basically an additional tax that a country will put on when one country sells a product into its market. So say, for example, Taiwan wanted to sell automobiles in the United States could put on, say, a 25% tariff. That would be really high. So they have to pay an additional 25% tax to the US government just to sell the car within the United States. The reason governments do that is to kind of protect their own industries, right? To make it more difficult for foreign industries to compete against their own. The idea is that basically we would resolve all those issues under free trade. You're generally reducing, or at least, reducing, often kind of completely eliminating those types of tariffs. You're kind of coming to agreements on maybe environmental standards and how to protect intellectual property. But what the literature is really referring to is how to negotiate a comprehensive free trade agreement amongst those between the United States and Taiwan that governs those issues. And what will help through, as I mentioned earlier, and this will kind of give you some of the main ideas, all right, that are kind of conflicts or issues that would need to be resolved, right? Under the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, which I just talked about, this goes all the way back to 1994. In 1994, both countries, especially Taiwan, they had a lot of tariffs, really agreed to significantly reduce many of the tariffs they had on the importation of goods from the United States and to, kind of cut some of the tariffs altogether. 1997, they started discussing intellectual property. Intellectual property, physical property can be like your computer or whatever physical items you own. Intellectual property is essentially, if you think about it, if you come up with a patent or like you have some copyrighted material, right? How do you protect that intellectual property? Taiwan doesn't have a great history of protecting intellectual property, which makes it difficult, for companies to sell products and to kind of essentially kind of share ideas that one could have intellectual property protections for within Taiwan, because you could sell like a textbook and then all those could be copied and distributed within Taiwan, or a computer program. So it kind of started discussions of kind of how to better protect intellectual property. In 2002, there were actually attempts through this TIFA framework to negotiate a free trade agreement, but it failed. In 2004, there was progress and limitations under intellectual property. In terms of that issue, Taiwan agreed to protect intellectual property more, though there wasn't much enforcement. And they also, but they also at the same time banned the importation of many U.S. beef products. In 2007, they reduced the beef ban. In 2013 and 14, in some years that followed, we're kind of basically struggling with the same issues. So those aren't all the issues, but you can kind of see, many of the kind of the struggles that we have kind of in terms of kind of resolving some of these issues with Taiwan. But basically the idea is that the United States and Taiwan would come together and kind of adopt and then implement a free trade agreement to kind of resolve the remaining tariff issues, intellectual property rights issues, anything kind of related to agriculture, also related to, issues of textiles, right? Like clothing, other types of items related to that. And just kind of make it easier for companies in both countries to sell goods in each other's markets. Now, first of all, I'm going to go through the pro arguments. There are a lot of different pro arguments. As you'll see, some of them can be related to one another. So how people may articulate these in a debate may change. Some of these different ideas could be combined. They could be separated. I'm presenting them here as separate because I just think it'll help with the understanding. And because you may need to debate them individually, but you may also see components of these particular arguments within each side's argument. So first of all, look at kind of the basic idea of contention that China is a threat. And there's a couple manifestations of this, right? Like both that they're like a direct military threat to Taiwan, or that they're a broader threat in the region. So there is some evidence that says between 2027 and 2030, China is kind of going to attack Taiwan militarily and try to absorb it. There's a debate about, where this date really comes from and whether or not there's kind of any support for it. But some pro teams will probably kind of try to establish a time frame with that particular argument. As I mentioned at the beginning, with kind of the Russian, invasion of the Ukraine, some people think, Russia's trying to take like the Ukraine back. Maybe China will try to take Taiwan back. They both think that they belong to that. If you look in the history, right, like you have another government challenging a particular government. for what's the actual government of China. President Xi in China, he's much more nationalistic than kind of the couple presidents before him. Kind of wants to build up a strong China. When China starts to celebrate, looking at 2050, right? Its 100-year anniversary. So there are different arguments. This debate's been going on for a long time. If you've done a debate a while, you know about that as to whether or not China is a threat for Taiwan. And also kind of more broadly in the region, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But China's building up, some kind of artificial islands right in the South China Sea. They're trying to control resources. They're trying, they've gone to war with Japan in the past. There are tensions between China and Japan over the same type of issues. China expansionism in the region. Now, how might an FTA, a free trade area with Taiwan, contribute to kind of essentially some deterrence against China? Well, there's some evidence that says this would send a very clear signal of U.S. support for for Taiwan, right? Like, all right, we're going to enter into this free trade agreement. We're very kind of committed to you, really kind of as a country. Maybe we probably wouldn't go that far because some people say if the U.S. explicitly recognized Taiwan as an independent country, that would cause China to attack Taiwan. But we wouldn't really go that far. But it's kind of a pretty strong signal of support. And there's some evidence that says kind of that like lack of like real clear commitment to the United States by the United States might tempt China. Would also increase defense cooperation between industries, right? You would have more sharing of kind of intellectual property. You'd have technology development that occurs, kind of more sharing of ideas, more maybe cooperative, even just cooperative agreements between defense companies in both places. A2D2 refers to anti-access and anti-denial. The idea is that Taiwan's military has developed a lot of kind of essentially military doctrine to deny China access, militarily to kind of some of the areas near Taiwan. And, of course, in the event of a conflict to Taiwan itself, as China has grown, arguably increased its military threat in the region, that anti-access or anti-denial kind of military doctrine could help the United States military in its challenge towards China. And there's evidence that says that within this FTA that could kind of help build those ties. There's also a lot of ties between democracy and just strengthening free market economies. The United States kind of closely aligning itself with the democracy, which could kind of challenge China. Now, and again, the second thing is something that you might see kind of embedded into a contention about the China threat, or it could be argued separately. But the idea is that China kind of presents kind of an especially strong threat in the area of technology. That China has really strong, basically really strong science and kind of engineering kind of programs and defense companies, and it really has very strong advancements in areas such as like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, like biologics, right? And these have military applications, first of all, right, in terms of the development of these technology, but also that there are standards, right, as technologies develop, right, certain kind of standards for how those technologies are used, essentially so that they can kind of work across suppliers, like are developed, so that they're kind of developing these standards and then locking in other countries and businesses and peoples around the world using this technology, and that there is kind of some competition that, especially that maybe if the Taiwan doesn't work as closely with the United States, then maybe there may be more cooperation with countries in China, which could cause other problems. Now, how would adopting or implementing a free trade agreement solve this? Well, first of all, within the free trade agreement, you could negotiate some technology standards, maybe even some that are somewhat a bit hostile or exclusive of Chinese products. There could be more mutual investment in each other's technology companies. There can be stronger kind of military to military cooperation, which would kind of reduce the influence of China in particular areas. And, if you debated kind of previous topics, that 5G, the new kind of faster, essentially cellular service, right? There's evidence that says China was developing a lead in this, and that other people would end up on China's 5G networks, which allow China to collect all its data, all the data on all the users, et cetera, and that we need to kind of work with Taiwan to, they have advances in this area. We need to strengthen our own industries in this area to compete with China and prevent them from having this type of influence. In terms of additional impacts, right, you could be looking at kind of once this is shared, right, between between Taiwan and the United States, we could then share kind of these developments with our allies in Europe, or kind of work on these cooperatively, but kind of undermine China's kind of growing kind of influence in control of development of technology in the world. Again, kind of related to this, right, is kind of another manifestation. There's kind of an argument that essentially says the United States needs to kind of strengthen and the development or protection and influence of democracies globally. That we need to kind of more closely align with the democratic countries of the world, Taiwan being one of them. Why? Because China itself is kind of becoming more authoritarian. As I said earlier, President Xi is not only more nationalistic, but the previous kind of president opened up the country a lot more. We kind of supported a lot more globalization. There was kind of more capitalism. There was a stronger development of like a market economy. The government it did allow kind of more free expression than the current government does. But the idea is that China is kind of becoming more authoritarian, and the world itself is kind of becoming less democratic. There's really kind of strong evidence that, if you look at kind of the global, like what they call the global freedom index, the freedom around the world is declining, and that China wants to spread kind of non-democratic norms and ideas. So we really need to commit strongly to Taiwan, right? It's a symbol of U.S. support for democracy, kind of globally. It's supporting a democracy, Taiwan, very committed to democracy. And of course, as we discussed, it's a military and economic challenge to China. And you could just kind of have some other impacts about why democracy is good. But as you see, these arguments can kind of be made separately, but they are related to one another, so, and can be strengthened by one another. So exactly how teams will articulate these in debates kind of may change a little bit from debate to debate. Now, in terms of some other arguments, we talked about kind of particular areas, right? I mentioned a few where, the idea or broadly, right, how the United States and Taiwan can kind of like cooperate with one another. And one particular area is in cyber defense, right? And you could talk about the cyber threat, like China's cyber threat to Taiwan. You could talk about Russia, really even Russia's threat to the United States and Europe. Okay, we could talk about cyber terrorism. We could talk about quote unquote rogue states, right, such as Iran and like North Korea developing cyber weapons. And that if the United States cooperated more with Taiwan, right, we would have more technology development in these areas to have stronger cyber defenses. If we have intellectual property rights protection, right, through a free trade agreement, this cooperation may be more likely to happen. And then, of course, it's like I say, this technology, once it's developed, it's not like it would only be useful to have this technology and maybe help Taiwan to fend off China, right, to fend off a cyber attack from China, but it could strengthen U.S. cyber defenses, both against like China, against Russia. We would share this with, potentially share this with our allies, of course, through NATO and in Europe, which is, the policy debate topic, or part of the policy debate topic for next year, to defend ourselves against the Russians. So you could have just kind of general cyber impacts, war, kind of blackouts if they take down the power grid, power plant meltdowns if the power plants you lose access to the grid and can no longer have the needed cooling to prevent the meltdowns. Cyber attacks and those types of things have been debated, for a long time in debate, and of course, as I said, will be debated even more next year. So I see this as a strong kind of potential area. Obviously, a lot, as you've heard kind of recently in the news, right, there's a lot of kind of issues related to supply chains, right? Supply chains are, once you have a product, right, like whether it's a piece of furniture, a vehicle, which has a lot more parts, right, or a computer, these are all essentially assembled, right, from supplies that comes from different areas, from companies that specialize in essentially kind of building or creating those different supplies. And globally, because of largely, right, because of COVID, with industries being shut down, we're kind of suffering from shortages within those supply chains. And if there's a disruption in one part of the supply chain, right, then that whole product like can't be completed, right? So if it's kind of hard to get particular chips, then it's hard to build cars, right? Even if we have all the other parts of the car, if we don't have the chip, you can't like kind of complete the car. But anyhow, there's a lot being kind of written and discussed recently about supply shortages, first of all. And then second, because so many of these supplies are manufactured in China, there's a lot written about why kind of this dependence on China can be bad. So, because obviously if there's a conflict with China or bad relations with China, they could prevent their companies from exporting those supplies, which would, hurt not only the U.S. economy, but potentially the U.S. military, which, relies on these, contractors to create these military systems, which also use these supplies. Now, how could a free trade agreement solve this? Well, it kind of can produce a reliable partner between the United States and Taiwan, and, we just need electronic supplies. These could strengthen our economy, reduce our dependence on China. Like I said, it's kind of important, arguably, to the development of kind of new military technologies and weapon systems. This could also potentially benefit the U.S. economy. I mean, obviously, the U.S. economy is like in a kind of in a unique position now, right? Like prior to the pandemic, you'd always just kind of talk about, oh, well, we need to kind of have more jobs for people, right? The industry needs to create jobs so people can have more jobs and they can get hired to do more things. Well, right now we're kind of in a bit of a strange place, right? We don't need kind of a ton of new jobs to be open. I mean, industries as they are kind of struggling to employ people, to find enough workers. So I don't really know if we need at this moment in time, right? We probably don't need a lot of new job opportunities to become available in the United States. But we're talking here about a free trade agreement, right? At least arguably and hopefully last for decades, not just at the moment. So there's some benefits that can be gained to kind of developing more jobs, right? Opportunities. If the United States can export more products to Taiwan, then people are going to have to be involved in production and export of those products. That creates jobs. In our manufacturing, as I said, a lot of the the parts of the products essentially come from all these different places. If we can't access the parts, then we can't manufacture the final product. There's evidence about how the auto industry in particular, right? We could sell more more autos abroad. That could help the industry. And then there's kind of just a debate about whether or not like free trade in itself kind of is good or bad. So for example, you could have arguments in the free trade good side. Why is free trade good? Well, it lowers costs, right? If you have a lot of people, if somebody's basically just making like one product or one particular product, they have what you call an economy of scale, right? So industry A makes, this particular thing. Industry B makes this particular thing. Industry C makes this particular thing. And then all these things are combined together. That creates kind of lower costs. It makes things more efficient, kind of creates this economy of scale, allows industries to focus on particular technologies, particular talents and skills that can be used. That's the basic idea behind free trade. It also can allow you to produce things at lower costs, right? Why are all these goods kind of being imported into the United States, right? Or these parts being imported to the United States in other instances? Because labor costs are lower elsewhere, right? So if the labor costs are lower elsewhere, and that's why everything at Walmart, essentially is really cheap. Goods on the whole are cheaper than they used to be relative to people's wages. So now as Americans are able to buy more things, right? So that's kind of the argument for free trade. There's obviously debate about it, but there's kind of an argument this could strengthen the economy in the United States, kind of reduce poverty, or, just kind of strengthen our economy generally. One particular area that kind of gets a lot of play is kind of agriculture exports. That, more free trade between Taiwan and the United States could increase agriculture exports. I don't know, there's like a great argument at the moment for a couple reasons. First of all, as you may have heard, there's kind of an emerging global food crisis, right? Due to the war in the Ukraine, because between Russia and the Ukraine, they export an enormous amount of just like wheat, for example. I think it's 30% of the world's wheat. So causing food prices to rise kind of a lot. And food supplies are an issue. So I don't know how much more food we want to export at the moment. But that's kind of one thing. And then the second thing is Taiwan already reduced a lot of its exports, at least on beef, on tariffs on the import, I should say, of U.S. exports, right, to Taiwan. So I don't really know how much more a free trade agreement would help with that. But that could be debated a little bit. But the idea is that the free trade agreement would expand agriculture exports. This could reduce unemployment in rural areas, strengthen rural economies, and reduce poverty. As climate change, debaters, always like to talk about climate change. Obviously, they're basically in the status quo. We have temperatures increasing. We have climate change. There's evidence that says that Taiwan's really good at like electric battery development that could help the development of electric cars and just kind of the use of batteries. We need batteries for, to use store power from alternative energy sources rather than running on combustible fossil fuels that generate carbon dioxide. This could reduce climate change, and you have all of the impacts of climate change. One additional thought at the moment is you might be able to say, hey, there's already a lot of kind of trade happening between the United States and Taiwan, but we need a free trade agreement to come to some standards to protect our intellectual property. I think, standards could be kind of a whole kind of interesting area in terms of cases that develop. You could say that the reality is that there is a lot of trade now between the United States and Taiwan, right? There's even a debate. If you kind of read the literature as a whole, it says that this would probably help facilitate a little more trade, but probably would not make an enormous difference just because there already is a lot of trade. And Taiwan is obviously, it's a small territory or a country, depending on how you define it, right? It's not going to have a huge effect in terms of that way, but negotiating the agreement could lead kind of some standards and enforcement to protect intellectual property, maybe to lead to development of kind of more kind of environmental standards. It could lead to development of like technology standards in the areas of like 5G or artificial intelligence or anything like that. So even though there's a lot of trade in the status quo, I think this kind of needs a little more unpacking than even a kind of, it kind of needs some more detailed research than kind of beyond the general FTA debate, but really kind of talking about how there's a lot of trade that's occurring now between the countries, and we really need a free trade agreement to set some standards, important standards in these areas would be helpful. All right, now let's turn to the con arguments. I don't think there are a lot of con arguments, and that doesn't mean that like I think the free trade agreement is good. I just think there are a lot of different arguments in favor of the free trade agreement, whereas there really aren't that many objections. If you look in some of the other handbooks and things that have been produced, they have some additional objections, but when you really look at the link evidence, it's really not talking about free trade agreement. But it seems like people were really struggling to come up with arguments. For example, I saw one that said, well, gee, this would like alienate like North Korea. Well, I mean, the link evidence didn't talk anything about a free trade agreement, just talked about U.S. relations with Taiwan, like we already have some relations with Taiwan, right? It didn't even talk about stronger relations with Taiwan. I mean, North Korea already obviously does not like the United States. Biden is just going to South Korea now to strengthen the alliance. So it just seemed like a really weak argument. It seems like in some cases people are just kind of really grasping for straws, which I think will also happen at the tournament. So I'm not going to cover a lot of con arguments in this section because I don't really think that the evidence I've seen for some of these other ones is honestly, I think it's terrible. But I think that there are some, these are kind of arguably strong objections. And I'll talk about those. And I think it's a little tricky to articulate in the debate, but I think I need to do it to win. So the largest really objection, probably the main reason we don't have a free trade agreement with Taiwan is because this would really anger China, right? Arguably, and if you think back to kind of what the links essentially to the pro arguments are, right? The United States really kind of unambiguously signaling a commitment to Taiwan, right? Arguably as a country, right? You could debate about that, right? This would kind of really be alienating to China. I mean, China does not even regard Taiwan as an independent country. China regards Taiwan as part of it, right? So strengthening these developing this FTA would definitely strongly alienate China and hurt relations. Now, it's a little bit of a tricky position because obviously U.S. relations with China, right, are not in the best spot right now. There's a lot of tension between the countries, like related to trade, related to China's military development, or related to Chinese actions in the South China Sea, and as I said, China becoming more authoritarian, right? So it's kind of, as a debate argument, you always need uniqueness, right? And you kind of say like, hey, like relations are, kind of okay now, getting better, right? Kind of the plan in this case, like in PF, we don't have plans, but in this case, like the free trade area, right, would alienate China, hurt relations. Relations are frosty. So you got to kind of, given that, you need to, on the con, really explain like, okay, well, these other things are kind of frosty, relations aren't perfect, but this would really be like a really major problem, right? So you really need to explain, you have some good evidence and really explain like why this would be such a significant blow to relations that are kind of not great now, right? But are really terrible, right? So would be really terrible if we implement this free trade agreement. There's evidence that says, bad relations increase the chance of war with China, that it makes it harder for the United States to work with China to resolve other problems. I think one thing you could say is that the United States is kind of pressuring China not really to support Russia on the Ukraine. And that has been kind of effective. But if we really do something to really alienate China right now, then maybe they would start supporting Russia more on the Ukraine. Maybe they'd even start like selling them weapons or providing them intelligence to help target Ukrainian troops. And, then that would cause the war to spread or allow Russia to win the war. It's kind of something that timely, right? A timely kind of impact scenario that gets it kind of like, well, gee, this would be a new thing that arises, right? Maybe relations aren't great, they're okay, but now you have this new kind of thing that gets thrown into the relations at a delicate time, right? When we're trying to keep Russia on board without support, keep China on board without supporting Russia in the Ukraine. There's also evidence that kind of just ties this a little more directly to trade relations, right? There's evidence that says we don't want to do this because it would upset trade relations with China, right? So, and then if you think back to that, right, some of the other impacts that like we've just been talking about. Well, the U.S. trade relations with China, and our producers can't export, or it's more difficult for our producers to export to China because maybe China raises tariffs, right? That's going to hurt the U.S. economy, right? That's going to hurt U.S. agriculture exports. That's going to hurt U.S. auto exports, right? So, it could potentially, like I say, we already have a lot of dependence on China for like semiconductors, other technology parts that make up our products. If China reduces the export of those and makes it more difficult for their companies to export to the United States, then we're going to have a lot of problems, right? Then there's going to be a lot of kind of problems that develop with the export of U.S. industry, the U.S. military is going to be affected. And of course, even though we can now, under the FTA, get some of that from Taiwan, their it's a small place, right? So their own production is limited. So I think you could use some of those relations arguments to kind of turn the case. But what I really want to emphasize here is that you need to have like a bit of a nuanced argument, right? I don't think just saying, well, gee, this alienates China, it's bad for China in the United States to have bad relations. I don't really think that's going to be a winner because relations are already kind of frosty, right? And there's a lot of issues that affect relations. But if you can kind of make arguments as to like why it would be really bad right now to give China a little bit of a gut punch because it could undermine cooperation like on the Ukraine, right? On isolating Russia, right? Right now, I think that could be help. Like that could be a winner. I think it could be a winner to say it's going to impact it in some particular area such as trade, and that's going to cause problems for the United States, and maybe even turn back a lot of the case can be helpful. I think the second thing you can say is that like, hey, in the status quo, right? Like, or just say like, if you come this and you pull China closer into the U.S. orbit, like this could hurt China's economy, right? Which could cause poverty in China and political instability. Now, again, the status quo economic situation in China is not great. They're really trying to battle COVID. There's a lot of lockdowns going on. Their economy is really, really, really kind of struggling, right? So you want to have a little bit, you need to account for that. Say, look, it's not going to be like that forever. Eventually, they're going to rebound. something of that nature, right? And that there's otherwise going to be a lot of kind of political, instability in China if the economy goes down. So it's not so good to just pull China or pull Taiwan out of China's economic orbit completely. That could hurt the China's economy and cause other problems for the United States. You could talk about how this can hurt Taiwan's economy. The basic argument is that if the U.S. exports a lot more goods to Taiwan, then their own producers aren't going to be able to compete. Their own agriculture producers aren't going to be able to compete. Their own auto industry won't be able to compete. That's why countries, are often kind of reluctant to embrace free trade, right? They think that the industries that produce these goods, right, and when you're involved in production of goods, you're employing a lot of people, right, who don't have a lot of money, that they're really going to be hurt. And this can kind of create poverty and political instability, and lead to cuts kind of in the social safety net. The social safety net is basically your welfare programs, your anti-poverty programs. The argument is basically if the economy goes down, then the government will collect less taxes and they'll have less money to be able to fund those programs. You can also make some arguments about just why free trade is bad. There's kind of a big debate that's kind of been in debate forever about. I debated free trade good bad in 1992, for example. Okay, about how free trade. Well, does it hurt the environment, right? And there's some basic arguments, right? Like we have to send these goods back and forth across oceans, right? That takes a lot of energy, so that's one problem. The second is that one way company or countries try to compete with one another is to reduce their environmental regulations or standards so that industries can more kind of cheaply produce goods, which can lead to environmental problems. They might try to compete by kind of making by reducing labor protections, by making people work longer hours under more difficult conditions, by paying them less money. That could, there could be problems there. Some people just say it spreads diseases, right? More travel, international activity, more opportunities for people to interact and spread disease. And then, of course, we have kind of invasive species, right? You have a species kind of jump on like an airplane and essentially, or a boat in the water, and then it kind of ends up in foreign waters where it doesn't have a lot of competitors. It kind of takes over, it dominates the area. So anyhow, there's just some basic arguments as to why increasing the amount of free trade is bad. Now, what are I put this under weighing considerations, but they're not kind of your traditional magnitude scope thoughts here. They're kind of some broad issues I think you want to consider when constructing your argument so you can kind of end up into the right place in summary and to final focus. I think that each side in most debates is going to kind of need to win kind of a picture of China, right? So the pro is going to want to win that kind of China is kind of a threat, right? That regardless of kind of what additional steps the United States does, it's going to be a threat to Taiwan because it wants to reabsorb it, to Asia because it wants to expand its influence, right? And that therefore, hey, we need to kind of solidify our relationships with Taiwan for the reasons I mentioned that China challenges. The con's going to want to say, hey, look, this idea that China is this big threat is really kind of exaggerated, that they're not really going to kind of, launching a war in like Taiwan would be like a huge commitment. Look at all the struggles Russia's having. Look at how the world interacted. Sure, they're trying to get more energy in places like the South China Sea, right? But they're not really kind of that, they're not like that kind of aggressive. They're not going to start wars. And if we kind of align with Taiwan, that's really going to alienate them. That they're going to think that like we're kind of taking the side of this government that's not really even what they don't even consider to be a government, and that legitimate government, right, of a separate country. And this is going to kind of risk the impacts that they're trying to solve for. I think the second thing is, how is technology developed, right? Like the pros kind of painting this picture of, well, gee, we really need Taiwan, right, to be involved in this development of technology with the United States. So or we're not going to be able to access it. The con needs to say, hey, the United States is working hard to develop these technologies on their own, and we are becoming our own leader. And if we just kind of do more cooperative ventures with China, the intellectual property, even if we agree to these protections, in the in the free trade agreement, they're not really going to be enforced. A lot of our technology is going to get stolen. Taiwan's going to continue to cooperate with other countries like China. It's going to make it into there. We'd be better off just developing these unilaterally. And then I think the third thing is kind of to consider is like how to kind of manage these kind of different arguments, right? Like when the the pro, I think in a way could kind of make a lot of different arguments. Maybe start even with 3 contentions. I usually just recommend like a 2 contention case, but the pro could even start with like 3 contentions, okay, and end up then just choosing one at the end. The con, I don't know if they're really like 3 strong arguments. I mean, just kind of really kind of bear into like this first kind of China argument, like this relations kind of alienating China is bad argument, and then kind of technology control. I don't think they have as many different arguments to choose from, so they're going to kind of want to think about what they want to do with that. But anyhow, those are some initial considerations for the topic. We have the release available to our subscribers, and I hope this will get you started with your debates.